What if the story of one of the world's oldest living civilizations did not begin with an emperor or a wall or a great battle, but with a single farmer kneeling in soft yellow soil beside a slow brown river, pressing seeds of millet into the ground, and looking up at a sky he believed was watching him? Long before there was anything called China, before there were emperors or dynasties or the idea of a single ruler over all the land, there were people like him, ordinary people whose names we will never know, who lived and worked and worried and hoped along the banks of two enormous rivers, and who, without ever intending to, laid down the first soft layers of a civilization that would outlast almost every other on Earth. Tonight, we will follow the long and quiet story of ancient China, from those first farming villages in the Yellow Earth, through the shadowy age of the earliest kings, into the world of bronze and oracle bones, through the long, thoughtful centuries of the Zhou and the philosophers who walked their dusty roads, and onward to the first emperor who bound the land together and the great Han Dynasty that gave a whole people its name. It is a story that moves slowly, the way rivers move, the way soil builds up over centuries, the way memory settles in an old house, and that is exactly why it is a story worth listening to as you drift toward sleep. There is no need to hurry through it, no need to hold every date and name firmly in your mind. Let the details wash over you gently, like water over smooth stones. Let the names of old kings and forgotten cities become soft sounds in the dark. So lower the lights now and settle back, and let your shoulders grow heavy, and let this calm journey through the deep past move slowly around you. Like mist rising off a river at dusk, if you find comfort in these quiet walks through the ancient world, you are always welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need another calm night among the ruins and rivers of long ago. There is no rush here at all. These dynasties waited thousands of years to be remembered, and they will not mind in the least if you fall asleep long before their story ends. To understand how China began, we must first sit for a while with the land itself. Because in this story, the land is almost a living presence, shaping everything that grew upon it. Picture, then, a vast stretch of country in the eastern part of the great Asian landmass, a territory so large it holds within it deserts and towering mountains, dense forests and open grasslands, frozen northern plains and warm southern valleys. Across this enormous space run two great rivers, and almost everything in the early history of China gathers around them, the way people gather around a fire on a cold night. The first of these rivers is the one the Chinese would come to call the Huanghe, the Yellow River, and its name tells you at once its most important quality, for its waters run thick and golden brown with fine silt carried down from the soft highlands far upstream. This silt is the secret of the river's power. When the Yellow River overflows its banks gently in the flooding season, it spreads a rich layer of fertile soil across the surrounding plain, soil so soft and giving that early farmers could work it with the simplest of tools, soil that would grow grain generously year after year. But the same river that gave life could also take it away without warning or mercy. When the rains were heavy and the snows melted fast in the western mountains, the Yellow River could swell into a vast destroying flood, bursting its banks, drowning fields and villages, and sometimes abandoning its old channel entirely to carve a wholly new path across the plain, sweeping away everything that had stood in the way. Over the long centuries, this river changed its course many times, each shift a catastrophe for the people who had built their lives along the old banks. And so the people who lived beside the Yellow River learned, generation after generation, a lesson that would sink deep into the character of their civilization. They learned that nature was both generous and terrible, that survival depended on working together to control the waters, to build and repair the banks and channels, and that no single family could do this alone. The taming of the river required cooperation, organization, leadership, and patience. And in that long shared labor lay one of the deep roots of Chinese kingship itself. For a ruler in this land would always be, in part, a keeper of the waters and a guardian against the flood. Far to the south flowed the other great river, longer and warmer and gentler in temperament, the one we call the Yangtze. It wound its way through green hills wrapped in morning mist, through valleys where rain fell often, and the air hung soft and humid, flowing at last toward the eastern sea. Along its banks and in its wet lowlands, in a climate perfectly suited to standing water, people learned in time to grow rice in flooded fields, wading through the shallow water to plant the shoots by hand, tending the paddies through the warm seasons until the grain ripened. And so from very early on, two different worlds took shape within what would one day become China. In the drier, colder north along the Yellow River, people grew millet, a tough and humble grain that could survive short rains and cold winters. In the wetter, warmer south along the Yangtze, people grew rice in their flooded paddies. These two worlds, the millet north and the rice south, would remain distinct in many ways for thousands of years, in their foods and customs and rhythms of life, and the slow weaving together of them into a single civilization is part of the deep, quiet background of everything we will speak of tonight. But in the beginning, there was no China at all, no empire, no emperor, no wall stretching across the northern hills. There were only scattered villages of farmers, small clusters of houses standing along the rivers and their smaller streams, each village a little world of its own. And it is to these villages that we must go first, before we can understand anything that came after. For the great palaces and armies and philosophies of later ages all grew, in the end, from the soil these first farmers turned. We know about them not from any written words, for writing had not yet been invented in this land, but from the patient and painstaking work of archaeologists, who have dug carefully down through the yellow earth and uncovered the quiet traces of ordinary lives lived thousands of years ago. And what they have found is deeply moving in its ordinariness, in the way it shows us people not so very different from ourselves, going about the small business of living. In the north, along the middle stretches of the Yellow River, there flourished a farming culture that scholars now call Yangshao, named after the village where its remains were first recognized in the early years of the 20th century. These people lived in villages of round and rectangular houses, many of them partly sunk into the ground for warmth against the cold northern winters, their roofs made of thatch resting on wooden posts, a fire burning in a hearth at the center of the single room where a family cooked and slept and passed the long dark evenings. They grew millet in the surrounding fields, grinding the grain into meal on flat stones, and they kept pigs and dogs, and they hunted and fished to add to what the fields provided, and they made pottery, and their pottery is beautiful even now, thousands of years later. They painted their vessels with flowing designs in red and black, spirals and curving lines, images of fish and of strange human faces, patterns whose exact meaning is lost to us but which clearly held some significance, perhaps in ritual, perhaps in belief, perhaps simply in the human love of making beautiful things. When someone in a Yangshao village died, they were buried with care in shared cemeteries, sometimes with pots of food and simple tools placed beside them, as if the living wished to send the dead onward into whatever came next with something in their hands and something to eat along the way. That small gesture, the placing of food beside the dead, is worth pausing on in the quiet of the night, because it tells us something about these people that no list of tools or houses ever could. It tells us that they believed in some form that death was not simply an ending. It tells us that they loved and grieved, that they could not bear to send their dead away empty-handed, that they hoped for them. And this thread, this deep and tender concern with the dead and with what lies beyond, runs through the whole of Chinese history from these first villages onward, growing over the centuries into the elaborate ancestor worship that would shape the beliefs of kings and peasants alike. Already, in these painted pots and careful graves, we can feel the first faint stirrings of ideas that would endure for thousands of years. Further east, and a little later in time, there arose another farming culture, one that archaeologists call Longshan, and its remains tell of a world that had grown more complex and in some ways more troubled. The Longshan people were extraordinary potters, and they made a kind of black pottery so thin and fine and delicate, its walls sometimes no thicker than an eggshell, that it seems almost impossible such vessels could have survived the heat of the kiln, let alone the thousands of years since. To make such pottery, they had learned to use the potter's wheel, spinning the clay to shape it with a precision the older villages had never known. But the Longshan people left us something else, something more sobering than beautiful pots. They built walls. Around some of their settlements they raised barriers of earth, pounding the soil layer by layer into hard, dense ramparts, a technique the Chinese would use for their fortifications for thousands of years to come. And those walls tell a quiet but important story. Walls are built to keep something out. They tell us that by this time, in this land, there were things worth defending and people worth defending against. Grain now had to be stored in quantity, and stored grain is wealth, and wealth attracts those who would take it. Perhaps there were now leaders in these settlements, families who had gathered more than others, who organized the heavy communal labor of raising the walls, and who directed the storing and sharing of what the fields produced. Perhaps there was now, for the first time, something like inequality, something like power, something like the beginnings of rulership. Out of this slow gathering of wealth and organization and defense, out of small villages swelling into fortified towns and towns into something larger still, the first faint shapes of Chinese kingship began very gradually over many generations to form. The past rarely changes all at once. More often it changes slowly, almost invisibly, one wall and one stored harvest and one powerful family at a time, until one day the world has become something it was not before, and no one can quite say when the change happened. And here we arrive at the misty edge of memory, the place where the patient findings of archaeology begin to overlap and blur with the old stories the Chinese themselves told about their own beginnings. For the Chinese of later ages did not remember these first centuries as a time of nameless farming villages. They remembered instead a golden age of wise sage kings, legendary rulers of extraordinary virtue, who one after another taught the people the arts of civilization. They told of a figure they called the Yellow Emperor, said to have taught his people how to make clothing, how to build boats and carts, how to live in an ordered way. They told of other sage rulers who taught the people to farm, to fish, to understand the seasons. And above all, in the context of that great and dangerous river, they told the story of a ruler named Yu, whom later ages remembered as Yu the Great. The story of Yu is worth telling slowly, because it holds within it something the Chinese would believe about good rulers for thousands of years. In the days of Yu, so the old tradition goes, the rivers flooded terribly, the waters rising and spreading across the land, drowning the fields, and driving the people into desperation and misery. A man had been set to the task of controlling the floods before Yu, and he had tried to hold the waters back by building barriers and dams, and he had failed, for the waters overwhelmed everything he raised against them. Then Yu took up the great task, and he chose a different way. Rather than trying to block the floods by force, he studied the land and the flow of the water, and he set the people to digging channels and canals to guide the waters gently down to the sea, working with the nature of the river rather than against it. For many long years he labored at this work, and the story tells that he was so devoted to the task, so tireless in his service to the people, that 3 times he passed by the door of his own home without stopping to enter, though he could hear his own family within because he would not rest while the waters still threatened the land. Whether such a man ever truly lived, we cannot honestly say. The sources for Yu are legend, written down long centuries after the time they describe, and no inscription or object from that distant age confirms that any single ruler named Yu ever tamed the floods. But the story endured because it carried a truth the Chinese held dear, a truth about what a ruler ought to be. A worthy king in this vision did not simply sit above his people and command them. He served them, he labored on their behalf, sacrificing his own comfort and even his own family for the good of the whole. And crucially, he did not fight the great forces of nature head-on in a contest of brute strength, but understood them, worked with them, guided them wisely. This ideal of the ruler as servant and sage, as one who governs through wisdom and self-sacrifice rather than through force alone, would echo through Chinese thought for the whole of its long history. And it is worth carrying with you as we go forward into the ages of real kings and real empires, so that you may measure them as the Chinese themselves so often did, against the memory of Yu, working quietly among the waters. Tradition holds that Yu the Great founded the first dynasty of China, the Xia, and that when he grew old, he passed his position not to the most worthy man he could find, as the earlier sage kings were said to have done, but to his own son. And in that act, so the story goes, hereditary rule was born, the idea that power should pass down within a family from father to child. For a very long time, many scholars doubted whether the Xia dynasty had ever existed at all, suspecting that it was a tale invented by later generations who wished to give their own kings and their own traditions a dignified and ancient pedigree stretching back into the mists of time. And here we must be honest, as any careful teller of this old story must be, and admit the limits of what we truly know. The Xia dynasty remains genuinely uncertain. We possess no writing from it that names itself as the Xia, no inscription in which its kings speak to us directly, as the rulers of later dynasties would. What we do have in roughly the right region and roughly the right time is a scattering of archaeological sites, the most remarkable of which is a place now called Erlito, lying near the Yellow River in what is today the province of Henan. And Erlito is a genuinely astonishing place, for what archaeologists have uncovered there looks very much like an early city, or at least the center of an early state. They have found the traces of large buildings raised upon platforms of pounded earth, structures that once must have been palaces or temples, the ceremonial heart of some organized society. They have found workshops where bronze was cast, for the people of Erlitu had already begun to work that difficult and precious metal, making small vessels and objects of a kind that hint at ritual and status. And they have found burials in which some people were laid to rest with far greater wealth and ceremony than others, a clear sign of a society divided into ranks, with rulers and ruled, rich and poor. Whether Erlito was the actual capital of the legendary Xia dynasty, or simply an early state that later Chinese memory folded into the Xia story, historians continue to debate, and the sources do not allow us to be certain. What seems likely, what the earth itself seems to tell us, is that somewhere around 4,000 years ago, in this land of yellow soil beside the great river, the first genuinely organized kingdoms of China were quietly taking shape, whatever names we choose to give them now. And so the story moves gently onward, out of the mist of legend and half-remembered kings, and onto the firmer ground of history, to a dynasty of which we can be far more certain, because, for the first time in this long tale, the people themselves left us their own words, written down and preserved across more than 3,000 years. This is the Shang dynasty, and with the coming of the Shang, ancient China steps for the first time fully into the light of the written record, and begins, at last, to speak to us in its own voice across the enormous distance of time. The Shang ruled over the plains of northern China, along the middle and lower reaches of the Yellow River, for several centuries during the second millennium before the Common Era, roughly, as best scholars can reckon it, from around the 16th century to the 11th century before our era. And for a long while, the Shang, much like the Xia, were known only from texts, written down many centuries later, so that some cautious scholars wondered whether they too might be more legend than solid fact, a dynasty half dissolved into myth. But near the very end of the 19th century, a strange and almost accidental discovery began slowly to change everything, and to bring the Shang back into the light in the most remarkable way. In the medicine shops of certain Chinese towns, apothecaries were selling something they called dragon bones, old bones and pieces of shell that were ground into powder and used as ingredients in traditional remedies. And some of these bones, it began to be noticed by scholars with sharp and curious eyes, bore strange markings upon their surfaces, scratches and lines that looked, on close inspection, remarkably like an ancient and unfamiliar form of writing. Learned men began to gather these marked bones and to study them with care, and slowly, patiently, they came to understand what they were holding in their hands. These were oracle bones, and the markings scratched upon them were among the very earliest examples of Chinese writing ever found, direct and genuine messages from the vanished world of the Shang, questions and answers set down by people who had been dead for 3,000 years. To hold such an understanding is a strange and humbling thing, and to appreciate what these bones truly are, we must step for a while into the mind of a Shang king and his priests, into a world where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin and permeable, where the ancestors were not truly gone but had simply passed into another kind of presence, still watching over their descendants, still capable of helping or harming those they had left behind in the world of the living. The Shang believed, as far as we can reconstruct their beliefs, that their ancestors and above them a high and distant power sometimes called Di could influence the events of the world in countless ways. The coming of rain or its withholding, the success or failure of the harvest, victory or defeat in war, the striking of sickness, the birth of children, the fortunes of the royal house. All of these might depend upon the will and the mood of the ancestors and the high power above them. And so, to learn that will and to seek that favor, the Shang practiced an elaborate art of divination. And it is this practice that has left us the oracle bones. A priest, a specialist in these sacred matters, would take the flat shoulder blade of an ox, or sometimes the smooth flat underside of a turtle shell, and prepare it carefully, cleaning it and drilling into its back a series of small hollow pits. Then a question would be posed aloud, very often on behalf of the king himself, for the king stood at the center of this communication with the unseen world. The questions that were asked reach across the ages and touch us still, because so many of them are so deeply, achingly human. Will the harvest this year be abundant? Should the king lead his army against a rival people in the coming season? Will the queen's approaching childbirth be safe? And will the child be a son? Is a particular ancestor pleased with the sacrifices that have been offered? Or is he displeased and sending misfortune as a sign of his anger? Will it rain in the coming days? What is the meaning of the king's troubling dream? Even, in one famous case, whether the king's aching tooth was caused by the displeasure of an ancestor. Once the question was spoken, the priest would press a heated rod or point into the drilled hollows on the back of the bone, and the intense heat would cause the bone or shell to crack on the other side, and the pattern of those cracks, their shape and direction, and perhaps the sound they made as they formed, would be read and interpreted by the diviner as the answer of the unseen powers. And then, most precious of all for us, the question, and sometimes the interpretation, and even the eventual outcome, would be carved into the surface of the bone itself, in that early script, and the bone would be kept, and in time buried, and so preserved for 3,000 years until it found its way into a medicine shop, and then into the hands of a scholar who could read the questions of the dead. There is something profoundly moving about these bones when you truly sit with them in your imagination, here in the quiet of the night, across an almost unimaginable gulf of time. We can read the actual specific worries that troubled real human beings who lived and breathed and feared and hoped so very long ago. A king lies awake, worrying about a toothache. A ruler asks anxiously whether a strange dream is a warning of some coming disaster. A father-to-be wonders whether his wife will survive the dangers of childbirth. Someone simply wants to know whether it will rain, because the millet is dry in the fields and the family is hungry. These are not the grand and distant pronouncements of legend. They are the small, close, ordinary anxieties of people who wanted, as we all want, to know whether those they loved would be safe, whether there would be enough to eat in the coming months, whether the great and mysterious powers that seemed to govern their fragile world were angry with them or content. And because the questions were recorded, and because so many tens of thousands of these bones have survived, buried in great pits at the old Shang capital, and slowly recovered over the past century, we can reconstruct not only the names and the succession of the Shang kings, but something far more precious, something of how these ancient people actually thought and felt and feared. And there is a further wonder in the oracle bones, one that finally settled the old doubts about whether the Shang had ever truly existed. When scholars carefully read the names of the kings and ancestors recorded on the bones, and compared them with the list of Shang kings preserved in much later Chinese texts, written more than 1,000 years after the Shang had fallen, The two matched closely enough that the reality of the dynasty could no longer be seriously doubted. A civilization that some had thought half legendary had spoken again in its own ancient voice, naming its own kings, and confirming across 3,000 years that it had truly been. It is one of the quiet marvels of the study of the past, this reaching of a lost people out of the silence to say, "We were here, these were our kings, these were our fears." The great city of the later Shang stood at a place we now call Anyang, on the plain of the Yellow River in the north of China, and the excavation of its ruins over the past century has given us a vivid and detailed picture of what Shang life was like at its height. Here rose the palaces and temples of the kings, great halls built upon platforms of pounded earth, their wooden columns and beams long since rotted entirely away, but their foundations still clearly legible in the ground, so that we can trace the outlines of a ceremonial center that must once have been imposing indeed. Around this sacred and royal heart of the city spread the dwellings and workshops of the many people who made the city live and function. The casters of bronze and the carvers of bone, the potters and the weavers, and the farmers who worked the surrounding fields and brought their grain into the city. And so the story moves quietly forward, from the questions scratched on bone to the city, where those questions were asked, and to the extraordinary craft that made the Shang one of the wonders of the ancient world. For the Shang were master workers of bronze, and their achievement in this difficult art is one of the true glories of early human civilization, a thing that can still stop a visitor in silence before a museum case today. They cast enormous ritual vessels of bronze, some of them so large and heavy that they weighed hundreds of pounds, in a great variety of shapes, each suited to a particular ceremonial purpose. Some for holding wine, some for cooking or offering food, some for water. And they covered these vessels in dense, intricate, mysterious decoration, patterns that swirl and interlock across the surface. And again at the center of the design there appears a strange and powerful animal face, a creature of great staring eyes and curling horns and gaping jaws, which scholars have come to call the Doughty. What exactly this face meant to the Shang, whether it was a god or a spirit or a guardian or a symbol of some force we can no longer name, has been debated for a very long time, and the sources do not tell us. But its power is unmistakable even now, gazing out at us across the millennia from the green surface of the ancient bronze, at once beautiful and unsettling, familiar and utterly strange. These great bronze vessels were not made for ordinary use. They were made for ritual, for the all-important business of offering food and wine to the ancestors, of maintaining that vital connection between the living and the dead, upon which the Shang believed the order of the whole world depended. And when a great person died, these vessels were often buried with them in the tomb, so that the honored dead could continue in the world beyond, to make the proper offerings to the ancestors who had gone before them, keeping the sacred cycle unbroken even across the threshold of death. To possess such vessels, and above all to be buried with them, was a mark of the highest status, a sign that one belonged to the ruling families who stood closest to the ancestors, and to the high-powered Dian. To make bronze on this scale, and with this artistry, required an extraordinary organization of knowledge, labor, and resources. And here we begin to see how craft and religion and political power were fused together in the Shang world into a single gleaming whole. Bronze is not a metal found in the ground. It is an alloy made by combining copper with a smaller amount of tin, and both of these metals had to be mined, often in places far from the capital, and then transported over considerable distances to the workshops of the city. The proportions of copper and tin had to be judged with care, for the balance affected the strength and color and workability of the finished bronze. Great furnaces had to be built and fed and tended at high heat, and the vessels themselves were cast not in a single simple mold but in complex assemblies of many carefully fitted clay pieces, shaped and carved so precisely that the molten metal, when poured in, would flow into every fine line and curl of the intricate decoration. All of this demanded skilled specialists, organized labor, secure supplies of distant metals, and a central authority capable of commanding and coordinating it all. And so the command of bronze was itself a form of power, perhaps the deepest form of power the Shang knew. only a ruler who could organize the miners and the carriers, the woodcutters who fed the furnaces and the master craftsmen who shaped the molds, could produce the great vessels that expressed his unique connection to the ancestors, and thus his right to rule over other men. The bronze vessel was at once a work of art, a sacred instrument for feeding the dead, and a statement of royal authority. And in that fusion we can see something essential about the Shang world, and indeed about ancient China more broadly, where religion and rulership and craft were not separate spheres, as we tend to imagine them, but braided tightly together into a single strand. When you picture a Shang king now in the quiet of the night, picture him standing in the flickering lamplight of a great hall before an altar heavy with gleaming bronze, pouring out an offering of warmed wine to the spirits of his fathers, and believing with his whole heart that the safety of his people and the turning of the seasons and the coming of the rains all depended upon this quiet and solemn act. There is, we must acknowledge gently and honestly, a darker layer to the Shang world, and it belongs to the story even though we will not dwell upon it or linger over suffering, for that is not the purpose of our night together. When a Shang king died and was laid in his tomb, deep in the earth and surrounded by his bronzes and his jades and the treasures of his high rank, he was, in many cases, not laid there alone. Other human beings were placed in the royal tombs as well, servants and guards and captives taken in war, who accompanied their lord into the world of the dead, and the oracle bones themselves record, among their many concerns, offerings made to the ancestors that included human sacrifice, particularly of prisoners captured from enemy peoples. This is not something to describe in any detail, nor to sensationalize, and it is easy for us across the centuries to recoil from it. But it reminds us of an important truth about the study of the past, which is that the very same civilization capable of the delicate beauty of eggshell pottery and the sophistication of written divination and the sublime artistry of bronze also lived according to beliefs and practices that would deeply trouble us today. Human history is rarely simple, and the ancient world so often held tenderness and harshness close together, sometimes in the very same hands. What matters most for our understanding, rather than any dwelling on the practice itself, is what it reveals about how the Shang saw death and the world beyond it. For them, death was not an ending but a passage into another kind of existence, one in which the powerful still held their rank, still needed their attendants and their vessels, still required the continued offerings and service of those they had left behind. The dead king would go on being a king in the world of the ancestors, and he would go on watching over and influencing the world of the living, and the relationship between the two worlds had to be tended with the greatest care, through sacrifice and ritual, and the making of beautiful and sacred things. In this belief, terrible in some of its expressions, and yet profoundly human in its longing for continuity beyond death, we can see the same tender impulse that placed a pot of food beside a farmer in a Yangshao grave, now grown vast and elaborate and entangled with the power of kings. Beyond the palaces and the royal tombs and the bronze workshops, most people in the Shang world were, as in every age of the ancient world, farmers, living lives bound tightly to the soil and the seasons, lives not so very different in their daily rhythms from those of their ancestors in the painted pottery villages long before. They grew millet and wheat in the dry fields of the north, and they kept pigs and dogs and other animals, and they wove cloth from hemp for their everyday garments, and they raised silkworms. For the Shang already possessed the ancient Chinese secret of silk, the patient art of unwinding the impossibly fine thread from the cocoon of a particular moth whose caterpillars were fed on the leaves of the mulberry tree, and of weaving that thread into a fabric of extraordinary softness and sheen, a fabric that would, in ages far in the future, travel halfway across the world and make the name of China famous in lands its makers never dreamed existed. The farmer's year turned with the demands of the fields, the breaking of the ground and the sowing of the seed, the tending of the growing grain, the anxious watching of the sky for rain, or the dread of too much rain, and at last the harvest, and the storing of the grain against the long cold winter. Above these farming families stood the king and his nobles, who lived in a very different world, hunting in the countryside around the capital. a pursuit that was both sport and a kind of training for war, and waging war itself against neighboring peoples on the fringes of the Shang world, and above all performing the endless round of ceremonies and sacrifices that kept the ancestors content and the fragile order of the world intact. It was a society of clear and rigid ranks, held together by ties of kinship and by deep and shared obligations, and bound above all by the common belief that the dead watched over the living, that the ancestors could bless or curse their descendants, and that the proper offerings made in the proper vessels, at the proper times, by the proper people, were what stood between the whole delicate arrangement and disaster. Beyond the palace walls, life continued in its smaller ways, in the smoke of cooking fires at dusk, in the grinding of grain and the weaving of cloth, in the small joys and sorrows of families who knew nothing of the great affairs of state, and yet whose labor fed and clothed and sustained the whole of that glittering, solemn, ancestor-haunted world. And yet, as with all things under heaven, the Shang did not endure forever. To the west of the Shang heartland, in the valley of a river called the Wei, which flows into the Yellow River, there lived a people called the Zhou, and it was the Zhou who would in time bring the Shang dynasty to its end. For a long while, the Zhou had lived on the western frontier of the Shang world, and they had served the Shang, ruling their own western lands as vassals, and sometimes as allies, acknowledging the Shang king as their overlord. But the Zhou grew steadily in strength and confidence over the generations, and in the accounts that later Chinese tradition preserved, the last of the Shang kings came to be remembered as a cruel and dissolute tyrant, a man given over to wine and to pleasure and to terrible cruelties, who neglected the sacred rituals and abused and oppressed his own people until they longed for deliverance. We should hold such accounts with a measure of care in the quiet honesty this old story deserves, for they were written down by the victors, by the Zhou and their descendants, and it served the Zhou very well indeed to remember the ruler they had overthrown as a monster who had utterly forfeited any right to his throne. History, written by those who win a war, has a way of blackening the memory of the defeated, and we cannot now peer through the accounts to see the last Shang king clearly as he really was. But whatever the truth of that particular ruler's character, the broad historical shape of what happened is clear enough. Around the middle of the 11th century before the Common Era, the Zhou, under a leader whom later tradition remembered as King Wu, the martial king, gathered a coalition of allied peoples and marched against the Shang, and in a great and decisive battle they defeated the Shang army. The old capital fell, the last Shang king met his end, and a new dynasty took its place at the center of the Chinese world. The wheel had turned, as it would turn again and again across the long ages of Chinese history, and one great house had given way to another. And so the story moves quietly onward, from the world of bronze and oracle bones and ancestor-haunted kings into the long and thoughtful age of the Zhou, the dynasty that would endure in one form or another for longer than any other in the whole of Chinese history, some 8 centuries in all, and that would give to the civilization one of its deepest and most enduring ideas, an idea that would shape how the Chinese thought about power and rulership and the very meaning of a dynasty's rise and fall for more than 2,000 years to come. For when the Zhou seized power from the Shang, they faced a question that has troubled every conqueror in every age. By what right had they done this thing? By what right had they, who only recently had been mere servants and vassals of the Shang, risen up and destroyed the dynasty that claimed the favor of the ancestors and the high-powered DI, and set themselves upon the throne in its place? The Shang had ruled, so they claimed, because the ancestors and the high powers favored them. If that was so, how could the Zhou justify overthrowing them? The answer that the Zhou gave, or that their thinkers and scribes developed and refined in the years and generations that followed, was an idea of great and lasting power, and it would echo through more than 2,000 years of Chinese history, invoked by dynasty after dynasty down almost to modern times. They spoke of what we call the mandate of heaven. Heaven, which the Zhou called Tian, was understood as a great and impartial cosmic power, less a personal god in the way the Shang had perhaps imagined their high-power DI, and more a vast overarching principle of moral order that watched over the human world and desired above all that it be governed well and justly. Heaven, the Zhou taught, granted to a worthy and virtuous family the right to rule over all people. And this grant was the mandate. So long as the ruling house governed with virtue, cared for the welfare of the people, performed the proper rituals, and maintained order and justice in the land, the mandate remained with them, and their rule was legitimate and blessed. But, and here lies the revolutionary heart of the idea, if a dynasty grew corrupt and cruel and neglectful, if its rulers oppressed the people and gave themselves over to selfishness and vice and abandoned their sacred duties, then heaven would grow displeased and would withdraw its mandate from that unworthy house, and would grant it instead to another family more virtuous and more worthy, who would then rightfully rise up and replace the fallen dynasty. And how, the people might ask, could one know when heaven had withdrawn its favor from a ruling house? The signs, the Zhou taught, could be read in the world itself. They might appear in natural disasters, in devastating floods and killing droughts and famines and strange omens in the heavens, all understood as expressions of heaven's displeasure with the misrule below. And above all, the loss of the mandate could be read in the suffering and the rebellion of the people themselves. For a ruler who had lost the loyalty of those he governed had thereby revealed that heaven too had abandoned him. The Shang, the Zhou argued, had lost the mandate through the wickedness and cruelty of their last king, who had oppressed the people until heaven could bear it no longer, and heaven had therefore chosen the virtuous Zhou to sweep the tyrant away and to rule in his place. In this way, the Zhou transformed their act of conquest from a mere seizure of power by force into the fulfillment of a sacred cosmic purpose, the righteous execution of heaven's own judgment upon an unworthy king. It is worth pausing here, in the deepening quiet of the night, to consider just how remarkable this idea truly was, and how profoundly it would shape everything that came after in the long history of China. The mandate of heaven made rulership fundamentally conditional. A king held his power and his throne not simply because his father had held them before him, and not merely because he was strong enough to seize and keep them by force, but because heaven judged him worthy to rule, and heaven's judgment was revealed in the end, through the well-being and the loyalty of the common people. This meant something quietly radical. It meant that a bad ruler could rightfully be overthrown, for in losing the loyalty of his suffering people, he thereby demonstrated that heaven had already withdrawn its favor from him, so that rebellion against a truly wicked king was not a crime, but the very instrument of heaven's will. And it meant that every ruler, however mighty, lived always under a kind of judgment, obliged to govern with virtue and to care for his people, or risk the loss of everything. This gave to Chinese political thought a deep and enduring moral dimension that would never entirely fade across all the centuries that followed. For all the long ages to come, whenever a dynasty fell and another rose in its place, the new rulers would claim that the mandate of heaven had passed to them because the old house had grown corrupt and lost heaven's favor, and the fallen dynasty would be remembered by history as having forfeited the mandate through its failings and its vices. It was an idea of great flexibility and great power, for it justified successful rebellion after the fact, while it demanded genuine virtue and good governance from any ruler who wished to keep his throne secure. And it placed at the very center of Chinese kingship not the raw brute fact of power, but the solemn responsibility to rule well, a responsibility owed to heaven itself and measured, in the end, by the contentment or the misery of the ordinary people working in their fields. In this way, the memory of Yu the Great, laboring selflessly among the floodwaters for the good of his people, found its philosophical expression in the doctrine of the mandate, binding the ideal of the good ruler ever more deeply into the fabric of Chinese thought. Having conquered a vast territory far larger than they could possibly govern directly from their homeland in the western Wei Valley, the early Zhou kings adopted a system for ruling their new domains that would, in some of its outward features, come to resemble the feudal arrangements that arose much later and quite independently in medieval Europe, though the Zhou system grew entirely from its own soil and its own particular needs. They granted large territories across the conquered lands to members of the royal family and to trusted allies and loyal followers, who then ruled these regions as lords in their own right, holding their lands and passing them down to their heirs, while owing in return their loyalty and their tribute and their military service to the Zhou king at the center of it all. In return for these obligations, the lords governed their own people, maintained their own courts and their own armies, and defended their own borders, enjoying a great deal of practical independence in the running of their domains. In the first centuries of the dynasty, while the memory of the great conquest was still fresh and the prestige and power of the Zhou kings still stood high, this arrangement held together reasonably well. The king in his capital was honored above all others as the Son of Heaven, the single figure who alone could perform the highest and most sacred rituals that linked the whole human world to heaven above, and the lords scattered across the wide land acknowledged his supremacy and looked to him as the center and the source of legitimate order. It was, for a time, a functioning whole, a great web of loyalty and obligation stretching out from the sacred person of the king to the furthest borders of the Zhou world. And along the roads between the capital and the domains there moved the traffic of a working kingdom, messengers carrying the king's commands, lords traveling to the court to pay their respects and offer their tribute, soldiers marching to the frontiers, and the slow carts of grain and goods that were the tribute of the land flowing toward the center. Beneath this world of kings and lords and their courts, the ordinary life of the early Zhou continued in its ancient patterns, tied always to the fields and the turning of the seasons. Most people were farmers, working the land under the authority of their local lords, giving over a portion of their labor and their harvest to those set above them in exchange for a measure of order and protection. There survives from later times an idealized description of how the land was supposedly divided in this age, a pattern imagined to resemble the shape of the Chinese character for a well, a square divided into 9 smaller squares, in which 8 peasant families each worked one of the 8 outer squares for their own sustenance, while all 8 families together worked the central square, whose produce went to their lord. Whether the land was ever truly organized in so tidy and geometric a fashion, historians strongly doubt, and it was very likely more an ideal than a reality. But the image is worth remembering all the same, for it captures something true about the bond between the farming families and their masters, the exchange of labor and a share of the harvest for protection and a place in an ordered world. The villages were small and close, the houses of pounded earth and thatch, and life within them was hard, and often short by the measure of our own age, filled with the endless labor of the fields, and the ever-present uncertainty of weather and harvest. And the great events of the dynasty, the wars and the royal successions and the solemn rituals of the mighty, must have seemed distant indeed to a farmer bent over his millet in the heat and dust of a summer afternoon, or huddled with his family around the hearth fire through the long dark of a winter night, listening to the wind. And yet the demands that great world placed upon him in the tribute of his harvest, in the labor it required, and sometimes in the call to leave his fields and march to war, were real and heavy enough, so that the doings of kings and lords, however far away they seemed, reached in the end even into the smallest and humblest village, shaping the lives of people who would never see a palace or hear the name of the king spoken by anyone who had met him. And so the centuries of the early Zhou passed, and the story now begins to move, slowly and quietly, toward a long unraveling, for the great weakness of the whole Zhou arrangement lay hidden from the beginning within its very design, like a small crack in the foundation of a great house that widens imperceptibly with each passing year. The lords who ruled the scattered territories of the realm were bound to the king by ties of loyalty and of kinship. But loyalty has a way of fading across the generations, and kinship grows ever more distant and abstract as cousins become second cousins, and then strangers who share only a name and a legend of common descent. As the decades stretched into centuries, the lords of the various regions grew steadily more powerful and more independent, building up their own strength, while the authority of the Zhou king at the center slowly and quietly weakened. The regions became, in all but name, small kingdoms of their own, each with its own army and its own ambitions and its own quarrels with its neighbors. For a long while the outward forms were carefully maintained, the king still honored as the Son of Heaven, the ancient rituals still performed, the fiction of a single ordered realm preserved. But beneath those forms, the true substance of central power was quietly draining away, year by year, generation by generation, and a new and more turbulent age was slowly being born. The moment that historians have long marked as the great turning point in the fortunes of the Zhou came in the year 771 before the Common Era, when the western capital of the dynasty fell to disaster. The story, as later tradition preserved and embellished it, tells of a king who had lost the loyalty and respect of his lords, and of an invasion by peoples from the northwest who broke through and sacked the capital in the Wei Valley, and of the death of the king amid the ruin of his city. There is a famous and much repeated tale attached to this fall, a story that the sober judgment of modern historians treats with considerable caution, of a king so foolishly devoted to a favored consort, who rarely smiled that he lit the warning beacons meant to summon his lords to war merely to amuse her with the spectacle of their armies rushing to his aid, so that when a real invasion came at last, and he lit the beacons in genuine desperation, the lords, remembering how they had been mocked before, did not come, and the king perished. Whether there is any truth in this tale, or whether it is a moralizing story invented by later ages to illustrate how a ruler loses the mandate through folly and the neglect of his sacred trust, the sources do not truly allow us to say, and we may let it drift by as one of the old legends that gathered around a real catastrophe. Whatever the precise causes, the outcome was clear and momentous. The surviving members of the royal house fled eastward, away from the ruined western capital, and re-established the seat of the dynasty at a place called Luoyang on the central plain, nearer the heart of the Chinese world. Historians call the long period before this eastward flight the Western Zhou, and the age that followed it the Eastern Zhou. And the difference between the two is not merely a matter of geography and the location of a capital. For after the flight to the east, the Zhou kings were never again truly powerful. They remained, for many more centuries, honored as the sons of heaven, the sacred ritual center of the Chinese world, the one figure who could perform the highest ceremonies linking earth to heaven. But real power, the power of armies and wealth and decision, had passed decisively out of their hands and into the hands of the great lords of the regional states, who now maneuvered and warred and schemed among themselves, while paying only a formal and increasingly hollow respect to the diminished king in his eastern capital. The first long stretch of this Eastern Zhou age is known as the Spring and Autumn period, a name drawn in that quiet and understated way the Chinese so often named things, from the title of a spare and ancient chronicle that recorded, year by year and season by season, the events in one of the states. It was an age of many kingdoms, dozens of them at the outset, spread across the North China plain and reaching beyond it, some large and powerful and some small and vulnerable, each ruled by its own lord, each pursuing its own interests and its own survival. In theory, all of them still acknowledged the Zhou king as the son of heaven and the source of legitimate order. In practice, they competed endlessly among themselves for advantage, forming alliances and breaking them, swallowing up their weaker neighbors, and struggling for a kind of leadership and precedence over one another. For a time, the strongest among the lords would take on the role of what the Chinese called the hegemon, a dominant leader who claimed to act on behalf of the powerless Zhou king, to keep some order among the quarreling states, to defend the civilized center against the peoples on the fringes, and to uphold the proper rituals and the old agreements between the states. There was still, in this spring and autumn age, a shared sense of belonging to a single common world, a world of ritual and refinement, and there existed a set of understood rules about how wars ought to be fought and how nobles ought to conduct themselves, a code of aristocratic honor that softened, at least somewhat, the harshness of the constant conflict. Wars in this period were often fought by nobles from chariots, in accordance with elaborate conventions, and there were things a man of honor simply did not do, even to an enemy. It was still, in its way, a world with a moral shape to it. However often that shape was violated in practice, and beneath the wars and the diplomacy of the lords, ordinary life went on in the villages and the growing towns. The farmers working their fields, the craftsmen at their work, the merchants beginning to move their goods along the roads and rivers between the states. The whole slow business of living continuing beneath the shifting fortunes of the mighty, yet beneath the courtly forms and the old codes of honor. The world was changing in deep ways that would in time shatter those forms and codes entirely. The number of separate states slowly shrank across the centuries, as the strong swallowed the weak one after another, and the surviving kingdoms grew ever larger and more powerful and more ambitious. New weapons and new ways of making war emerged and spread. The old aristocratic warfare, conducted from chariots by nobles bound by their honor and their conventions, gave way over time to great armies of foot soldiers drawn from the ranks of the common people, fighting with a new and grimmer efficiency and far less regard for the old courtesies and restraints. And a new metal began to spread through the Chinese world, a metal that would transform both farming and war. Iron, which had been rare and precious, began to be worked and made more widely, and iron tools made the farmer's labor far more productive, letting him break harder ground and clear more land and grow more grain, while iron weapons made the soldier's work far more deadly. As agriculture grew more productive with the spread of iron tools and the digging of great irrigation works, the population of the Chinese world grew as well, and the states could feed and field ever larger armies. The stakes of their conflicts rose accordingly, and the wars grew more frequent and more total, aimed no longer merely at winning honor or precedence or a border district, but increasingly at the outright destruction and absorption of rival states. The gentle fictions and the aristocratic restraints of the spring and autumn age gradually fell away, and something harder and more ruthless took their place. And yet, in the very midst of this growing turmoil and violence, something truly extraordinary happened, something that makes this one of the most remarkable periods in the entire history of human thought, anywhere on earth. For as the old order visibly broke down, as the ancient certainties of the early Zhou dissolved into competition and bloodshed and disorder, thoughtful people all across the Chinese world began to ask deep and searching questions about how human beings ought to live, how society ought to be ordered, what made for a good and just life, and how order and peace might be restored to a world that seemed to be falling apart. Out of this age of trouble and uncertainty came a flowering of philosophy so rich, so varied, and so profound that later generations of Chinese looked back upon it and called it the age of the 100 schools of thought. It was as if the very collapse of the old order forced people to think for themselves about the deepest questions. Unmoored from the old assumptions, and thinkers arose offering many different answers, debating and arguing and teaching, wandering from state to state in search of rulers who would listen to their ideas. And among all these many thinkers, one man would come in time to stand above the rest in the depth and breadth of his influence upon Chinese civilization, though in his own lifetime he was little more than a wandering teacher who never attained the high office he sought and who died believing, in some measure, that he had failed. His name was Confucius, and the Western world would come to know him through a later Latinized form of his honorific title, Kong the Master, as Confucius. Confucius was born, according to tradition, around the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era, in the small state of Lu, in what is now the eastern province of Shandong. He lived in the deepening twilight of the spring and autumn period, in a world where the old order was visibly crumbling all around him, where lords defied the king and ambitious ministers defied their lords, where the rituals and the relationships that had once bound society together were being neglected and cast aside, and where the ancient bonds of loyalty and duty seemed everywhere to be dissolving into chaos and self-interest. Confucius looked upon all this disorder with a deep and genuine sorrow, and he came to believe that the true cure for it lay not in new and cleverer laws, nor in harsher punishments, nor in some ingenious new scheme of government, but in a return to virtue, to the proper and sincere observance of the relationships between people, and to the reverent maintenance of the rituals and traditions handed down from the wise and virtuous rulers of the ancient past. He insisted, with great humility, that he was not the inventor of any new doctrine at all, but merely a transmitter, a man who loved and cherished the old ways, and who sought only to preserve and revive them for a world that had forgotten them. At the very heart of his teaching lay a vision of human society as a great web of relationships, each one carrying with it its own particular duties and its own particular dignity. There was the relationship between ruler and subject, and between parent and child, and between husband and wife, and between elder brother and younger, and between friend. If each person, Confucius taught, would only sincerely and wholeheartedly fulfill the obligations proper to their role within these relationships, if the ruler would govern with genuine benevolence, and the subject would serve with true loyalty, if the child would honor the parent, and the parent would cherish the child, then society as a whole would fall naturally into harmony and peace. He placed an enormous weight upon the family, and especially upon the virtue he called filial piety, the deep and reverent respect and devotion owed by children to their parents and to their ancestors, seeing in the well-ordered and loving family the very foundation upon which the well-ordered state must be built. A person who truly honored his parents, Confucius believed, would carry that same spirit of respect and duty into all his other relationships. And so the moral order of the whole society grew, in the end, out of the moral order of the family hearth. He believed, too, and with great force, in the transforming power of moral example. He taught that a ruler who governed above all through his own genuine virtue, who was himself upright and benevolent and sincere, would inspire virtue in his people simply by the power of his example, as the wind bends the grass beneath it. So that good order would flow not from the fear of punishment, but from the natural human desire to follow and emulate a good and admirable leader. And he believed in what was a quietly revolutionary notion in that age of hereditary aristocracy, in the supreme importance of learning and self-cultivation, and in the idea that a person's true worth lay not in the accident of noble birth, but in the diligent cultivation of character and wisdom. Confucius took students to himself from many different backgrounds, some of them poor and of humble origin, and he sought to shape them into men of virtue and learning and moral seriousness, gentlemen not by the blood in their veins, but by the quality of their conduct and their minds, who might then go out into the troubled world and serve as wise and honest ministers, bringing good order to the states through their virtue and their counsel. He himself wandered for many years from state to state, traveling the dusty roads of a divided China with a small band of devoted students, seeking always a ruler who would truly take his teachings to heart and put them into practice, and so demonstrate to the world the power of government by virtue. But though he was honored and respected as a teacher of great learning, he never found the position of real influence and power that he sought. For the rulers of that ruthless age wanted practical advantages and military strength, not lessons in ancient virtue, and one after another they declined to employ him in any role of consequence. And so he died, tradition tells us, an old man who felt in some measure that his life's mission had failed, his cherished ideas unheeded by the powerful of his own day, his dream of a world restored to virtue and order as far from realization as ever. There is something quietly moving in this, in the picture of the old teacher on the road, carrying a wisdom the world was not yet ready to receive. And yet, in the long, slow, patient way that great ideas sometimes work upon the world, the teachings of this seemingly unsuccessful wandering teacher would outlast every single kingdom and every mighty ruler of his violent age. After his death, his students and their students after them gathered his sayings and his conversations into a collection, a book of brief and often beautiful fragments recording what the master had said on this occasion. And this collection, along with the larger tradition of thought that grew up around it, would become, in the centuries to come, nothing less than the very foundation of Chinese thought, of Chinese education, and of Chinese government. For more than 2,000 years, the ideas of Confucius would shape the lives, the values, the families, and the governments of countless generations of people across a vast portion of humanity, long after the small state of Lu and all the other states he had wearily wandered through in search of a listening ruler had vanished entirely into the dust of the past. Few lives that seemed, at their ending, so quiet and so disappointed have ever cast so long and so deep a shadow across the centuries. But Confucius was far from alone in his questioning, for this was an age teeming with thinkers, and the striking contrast between the different schools of thought reveals the true depth and range of that remarkable time. In the same troubled centuries there arose another great tradition of thought, one that later ages gathered under the name of Taoism, associated with a shadowy and perhaps legendary figure called Laozi, whose very existence some scholars have long doubted, and with a later thinker named Zhuangzi, whose surviving writings sparkle, even now, with paradox and wit, and a strange, dreamlike beauty, where Confucius had emphasized ritual and duty and the careful, deliberate ordering of human society. The Taoists turned their gaze instead toward nature and toward the great underlying way of all things, which they called the Tao, the way, the path, or current that flows silently through all of existence. They taught that the wisest course for a human being was very often not to strive and struggle and impose one's will upon the world, but to act in gentle harmony with this natural flow of things, to embrace simplicity and spontaneity, to distrust excessive cleverness and rigid rules and endless striving, and to find in the quiet patterns of the natural world a wisdom far deeper than any human scheme or system could ever provide. There is a profound gentleness woven all through Taoist thought, a love of the small and the humble and the yielding that has consoled and delighted readers for more than 2,000 years, and that offers a kind of peace especially suited to the quiet of a night like this one. The Taoists love to point to water as their great teacher and image, water that is the softest and most yielding of all things, that seeks always the low places that others disdain, that flows around every obstacle without struggle, and yet that over the long patience of ages wears away the hardest stone and carves the deepest canyons, and that gives life to all things without ever contending or boasting. They spoke, too, of the uncarved block of wood, the simple raw material that holds within itself all possibilities precisely because it has not yet been cut and shaped into any single fixed form. And they saw in this humble image a picture of the untouched natural state, full of potential that human cleverness so often spoils. In their vision, the sage was one who had returned to this simplicity, who acted without forcing, who led without dominating, who found contentment in the natural rhythms of the world, rather than in the endless anxious pursuits of ambition. And there were harder and colder voices too in this great age of thought, thinkers who looked upon the same disorder and violence of their times and drew from it very different conclusions. These thinkers, whom later tradition grouped together under the name of the legalists, concluded that neither Confucian virtue nor Taoist naturalness could ever truly restore order to a broken and violent world, but that only strict laws, firm and unfailing punishments, and the concentrated, disciplined power of a strong state could do so. They took a grim and unsentimental view of human nature, believing that people were driven fundamentally by self-interest, by the desire for reward and the fear of punishment, and that they could therefore be governed reliably only through a clear and rigidly enforced system of rewards and penalties, applied uniformly to all, high and low alike, without exception and without mercy. The ruler, the legalists taught, should never rely upon the uncertain and unreliable goodness of his subjects, but should instead build a strong and lasting state through good laws impartially enforced, through a disciplined and efficient bureaucracy, through a powerful army, and through a large and productive population, all of it organized and bent single-mindedly toward the strength and the survival of the state. Their vision was, to many both then and since, cold and harsh and even frightening, stripping away the moral warmth of Confucius and the gentle wisdom of the Taoists in favor of a machinery of law and power. But it was also, in the brutal and competitive conditions of that age, undeniably practical and effective, and in the ruthless struggle for survival among the warring states, it would prove to possess a terrible and world-changing power. For it would be a state that embraced these hard legalist ideas most fully and most thoroughly of all that would, in the end, rise above all its rivals and bring the whole long age of division and conflict to its close, uniting the entire Chinese world under a single ruler for the very first time. And so the different answers offered by the thinkers of the 100 schools were not merely matters of abstract philosophy, debated in quiet rooms. They were ideas with the power to shape the fate of nations, and the contest between them, between virtue and nature and law, between Confucius and the Taoists and the legalists would be settled, at least for a time, upon the field of history itself. To understand how that great settling came about, we must now move forward out of the spring and autumn period and into the age that followed it. An age whose very name tells us at once how much had changed and how much darker the world had grown. Historians call it the Warring States period, and it began around the 5th century before the Common Era, when the last of the old restraints and the old aristocratic codes finally fell away, and the surviving kingdoms, now reduced through centuries of conquest and absorption to just 7 great powers, threw themselves wholly and without restraint into a long and bitter struggle for supremacy over all. The Zhou king, still nominally the son of heaven, had by now become almost entirely irrelevant, a fading and pitiable symbol tucked away in his tiny remaining domain, while the great states fought without any pretense of deference for the right to rule all under heaven. This was warfare on a scale that the Chinese world had never before witnessed, waged by mass armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, supported by whole societies organized from top to bottom for the purposes of conflict, fought without the old restraining chivalry, and aimed now not merely at victory but at the utter destruction and absorption of rival states. And yet, as terrible as this age of constant warfare was, it was also in one of the great paradoxes that run through all of history, an age of astonishing growth and creativity and change. War, for all its horrors, drove innovation relentlessly, and the fiercely competing states, each of them desperate for any possible advantage over its rivals, reformed their governments and their armies, improved their agriculture, built great works of irrigation and flood control, developed their crafts and expanded their commerce, and eagerly gathered talented advisors and administrators and generals from across the whole Chinese world, offering advancement to any man of ability regardless of his birth. Cities grew large and populous and wealthy, filled with merchants and artisans and officials, and coins of bronze, some cast in the shapes of little knives and spades and others made round with a square hole punched through the center, passed busily from hand to hand in the crowded markets. Roads were improved and extended. Trade flourished even amid all the fighting, and ideas and techniques and goods spread from state to state along the routes of commerce and war. Great canals and vast irrigation systems were dug in these centuries, some of them so brilliantly engineered and so well made that they continued to water the fields of China for many, many centuries afterward, transforming dry and marginal land into rich and productive farmland and feeding the steadily growing population. One such great waterwork, built in the state that would eventually triumph over all the others, turned a whole region into an abundant granary that helped make that state's final victory possible. A quiet reminder that the fate of the warring states was decided not only by armies and generals, but by engineers and irrigation channels, and the humble essential matter of how much grain a state could grow. It was, in the end, a deeply paradoxical age, brilliant and terrible together, and inseparably intertwined, an age in which the very finest achievements of the human mind and the cruelest realities of relentless war grew up side by side, each one feeding and driving the other, in ways that would echo down through everything that came afterward in the long story of China. And among the 7 great states that contended so fiercely for the mastery of the Chinese world, one in particular lay in the far west, in the old Zhou homeland of the Wei River Valley, guarded on its eastern side by mountains and narrow passes that separated it from the crowded states of the Central Plain. This was the state of Qin. In the earlier centuries, it had been looked down upon by the more sophisticated and cultured Eastern kingdoms as something of a rough and half-barbarian frontier land, out on the wild edge of the civilized world, closer in its ways to the nomadic peoples of the steppe than to the refined courts of the East. But its geographical position was immensely strong, protected as it was by natural barriers of mountain and pass, possessing a fertile heartland, made more fertile still by great irrigation works, and populated by a hardy people long accustomed to hard living and to constant war against the peoples of the northern grasslands. And in the 4th century before the Common Era, the state of Qin embraced the harsh and practical philosophy of the legalists more fully and more thoroughly than any other state in all the Chinese world, undertaking under a famous and formidable minister a sweeping series of reforms that would remake the entire kingdom from top to bottom in the single-minded service of strength. The great reforms that transformed the state of Qin are associated above all with a minister whom history remembers as Shang, a hard and brilliant man who came to Qin from another state and who reorganized the whole kingdom according to the cold and rigorous principles of the legalist philosophy. Under his reforms, carried out in the middle of the 4th century before the Common Era, the old hereditary aristocracy of Qin lost much of its ancient privilege. For Shang decreed that rank and honor should be granted not according to the accident of noble birth, but according to actual achievement, and above all according to success and valor in war and to productivity in farming. A common soldier who fought bravely and took the heads of the enemy could rise in rank and win land and status, while a nobleman who did nothing of value might sink into obscurity. This was a powerful, and for its age, a startling idea, and it filled the armies of Qin with fierce and highly motivated soldiers who knew that their own advancement depended directly upon their courage in battle. Shang reorganized the whole population as well, grouping families together into units that were made collectively responsible for one another's conduct, so that if one member of a group committed a crime and the others failed to report it, all would be punished together. In this way, the reach of the state extended down into every household and every village, binding the entire population into a single vast web of surveillance and mutual responsibility, all of it directed toward order and obedience. The laws of Qin were made strict and uniform, and were applied, at least in principle, equally to high and low alike, with severe punishments for transgressions and clear rewards for compliance and service. The merchants and the scholars, whom the legalists regarded with suspicion as unproductive or as sources of dangerous ideas, were discouraged and controlled, while farmers and soldiers, the producers of grain and the wielders of weapons, the two things the state most needed, were honored and encouraged above all others. The whole of Qin society was reshaped, deliberately and systematically, into a single great engine for the production of grain and soldiers, disciplined, obedient, efficient, and utterly formidable. It was, by almost any measure we might apply, a cold and heavy and even oppressive way for people to live, a society stripped of much of its warmth and spontaneity and organized ruthlessly for the single purpose of state power. And there is a grim and telling irony in the fate of Shang himself. For according to tradition, the great reformer eventually fell victim to the very system he had so carefully constructed. When his royal patron died and Shang lost his protection, his many enemies among the old aristocracy turned upon him, and the story tells that as he fled for his life he was refused shelter at an inn because he could not prove his identity, the innkeeper explaining that under the strict laws of Shang himself, sheltering a person without proper credentials would bring severe punishment upon them all. And so the maker of the laws is said to have been undone and destroyed by the pitiless machinery he had set in motion. A story that later ages loved to tell precisely because it captured so perfectly the cold and impersonal nature of the legalist state, which spared no one, not even its own architect. But whatever became of Shang the man, his reforms worked, at least in the harsh terms that the age demanded of them. Over the following generations, the state of Qin grew steadily and inexorably stronger than all its rivals, better organized, better fed from its irrigated fields, better armed, and possessed of armies more disciplined and more numerous and more terrifyingly motivated than any others in the Chinese world. One by one, over the long decades, Qin pressed against its neighbors, winning victories, seizing territory, weakening the other great states through war and through cunning diplomacy that turned them against one another. The other kingdoms of the East, for all their wealth and culture and their long histories, could not in the end match the cold efficiency and the relentless pressure of the Qin war machine, and slowly, painfully, the balance of power tilted ever further toward the West, toward the once despised frontier state that had remade itself into the most powerful engine of war and government the Chinese world had ever seen. While this great and slow-moving struggle unfolded in the courts and upon the battlefields of the mighty, the lives of the ordinary people went on beneath it all, shaped in ways they could scarcely perceive by forces far beyond their understanding or control. A farmer in the state of Qin rose before the dawn to work fields whose every measure of yield was carefully recorded by the diligent officials of a state that wished to know precisely what it possessed and precisely what it could demand. His sons might at any time be called away to serve in the army, marching off toward distant and dangerous frontiers, and whether they ever returned home again was a matter of fortune and of the great decisions made far above their heads by men they would never see. In the markets of the eastern cities, merchants grew wealthy trading in grain and salt, in iron and silk and fine lacquerware, though the legalist thinkers regarded them always with distrust, seeing them as parasites who produced nothing of real value, while the honest farmers grew the grain and the brave soldiers fought the wars that truly sustained the state. Scholars and would-be advisors traveled restlessly from court to court across the warring states, offering their wisdom and their schemes to whichever ruler would consent to listen. For in this fiercely competitive age, a clever and eloquent mind could rise very high indeed, and the fate of an entire kingdom might turn upon the advice of a persuasive stranger who had arrived at the court only months before. It was an age of both great opportunity and great danger, an age in which the old certainties of birth and inherited rank had loosened and cracked, so that a person of real talent and daring and ambition might climb far above his origins, or might just as easily fall hard and lose everything, including his life. The world was in motion, unsettled and dangerous and full of possibility, and over it all hung the growing shadow of the Western state that was slowly, patiently, remorselessly gathering the strength to swallow it whole. And so, as the 3rd century before the Common Era wore on toward its close, the long age of division at last began to move toward its ending. One after another, the great states of the East fell before the growing, and now nearly irresistible power of Qin. Some were conquered outright by force of arms, their armies shattered, and their capitals taken. Some were absorbed through a combination of pressure and diplomacy and treachery, their rulers outmaneuvered and their alliances broken apart from within. Some were simply worn down by decades of relentless pressure until they could no longer stand and fell almost of their own exhaustion. The details of these many campaigns, the marches and the sieges and the battles, are numerous and often grim, and we need not follow every one of them through the quiet of the night, for the essential shape of the thing is what matters, and that shape is clear enough. It was the slow, patient, relentless swallowing of an entire civilization by a single state, disciplined and determined and utterly single-minded, driven forward by the cold efficiency of its legalist order and by the boundless ambition of its rulers. And at the head of Qin in these final decades of the great struggle stood a king who would become the single most consequential figure in the whole of ancient Chinese history, a man whose name and whose deeds still carry an immense weight more than 2,000 years after his death. He was born, according to tradition, around the middle of the 3rd century before the Common Era, and he came to the throne of Qin as a young boy, ruling at first under the guidance of powerful regents and advisors, for his father had died while he was still a child. As he grew into manhood, he took the full reins of power firmly into his own hands, and he proved to be a ruler of tremendous will and energy and ambition and capacity, a man of relentless drive who bent the whole vast machinery of the Qin state toward a single overwhelming and unprecedented goal, the complete conquest of all the other kingdoms, and the unification of the entire Chinese world under his sole rule. Year after year, under his direction, the armies of Qin advanced, and kingdom after kingdom fell before them, until at last, around the year 221 before the Common Era, the final rival state surrendered, and for the very first time in all its long history, the whole of the Chinese heartland was united under a single government and a single ruler. This king of Qin now found himself facing a situation that no ruler in the Chinese world had ever faced before, for he ruled over something genuinely and entirely new under heaven. He was no longer merely the king of one state among many contending states. He was now the master of all the states, the sole lord of the entire civilized world, as the Chinese of that age understood it. The old and familiar title of king, which so many rulers had borne, seemed suddenly far too small and too ordinary for what he had become, and so he cast about for a new title worthy of his unprecedented achievement, and he took for himself a grand new name that combined ancient and exalted words associated with the greatest and most godlike of the legendary rulers of the distant past. He called himself Huangdi, a title we render into English as emperor. He declared himself to be the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, the first august emperor of Qin, and in his boundless confidence and ambition, he further decreed that his descendants would rule after him in an unbroken line, as the second emperor and the third emperor, and onward through 10,000 generations. A dynasty that would endure, he imagined, forever and without end. There is a quiet irony in that grand decree of an eternal dynasty, which we will come to before long. But it is worth pausing first to note something remarkable, which is that from the name of his state, Qin, comes, many scholars believe, the very name by which the Western world would forever after come to know the vast land itself. The name China carried westward along the trade routes and passed from tongue to tongue across the whole breadth of the ancient world, so that this one ruthless and driven king, whatever else he did, gave to the country a name that has outlasted his dynasty by more than 2,000 years and endures upon our maps and in our speech to this very day. And what he did with the enormous and unprecedented power he had won, how he set about to remake the whole of the Chinese world in the image of his cold and ordered legalist vision, is a story both grand and strange, and it deserves to be told slowly here in the deepening quiet of the night. Having conquered all his rivals, the first emperor faced the enormous and genuinely difficult problem of how to hold together a land that had been divided for many centuries, a land of different regional customs, different spoken dialects, different forms of writing for the very same words, different systems of weights and measures and money, different everything. A lesser and less visionary conqueror might have been content simply to sit atop the old kingdoms, leaving them largely as they were and merely collecting their tribute and their submission. But the first emperor and his legalist ministers, who believed with absolute conviction that a truly strong and lasting state required uniformity and tight central control over every aspect of life, set out instead upon the immense task of welding the many diverse pieces into a single unified whole. And the tools they used to accomplish this welding were as remarkable in their far-reaching ambition as they were, in many cases, harsh in their execution. He abolished the old feudal states entirely, and completely sweeping away the ancient system of hereditary lords ruling their own domains that had defined the Zhou world for 8 centuries. Where once there had been kingdoms governed by noble families who inherited their power and passed it down to their sons, he now divided the whole of his vast empire into a rational system of provinces and smaller districts, each one governed by officials directly appointed by his central government, men who served entirely at the emperor's pleasure and who could be promoted, transferred, or dismissed at will as the throne saw fit. In place of the old hereditary nobility, whose power had always rested upon their birth and their inherited lands, there now arose a professional bureaucracy of appointed administrators, answerable directly to the center, whose sole task was to govern their assigned territories efficiently in the emperor's name and according to the emperor's uniform laws. This was a change of the very deepest significance, and although the dynasty that first made it would not itself endure, the fundamental principle behind it would outlast 100 dynasties. For much of the next 2,000 years, China would be governed not by hereditary lords ruling their own private domains, but by appointed officials serving a central emperor, a profound and lasting pattern of government first set down in these hard and driven early years of the very first empire, to bind the newly unified land more tightly together still. The first emperor decreed that the many different scripts that had grown up and diverged across the separate states over the long centuries of division should all be replaced by a single standardized system of writing, uniform across the whole empire. This was perhaps his most lasting and most beneficial gift to Chinese civilization as a whole. though he himself can hardly have understood the true depth of its significance. The spoken languages of China were then, and remain even now, deeply varied from region to region. So different in many cases that people from distant provinces might be entirely unable to understand one another's speech, as if they spoke separate tongues. But a shared written script, in which each character stood for a meaning or a word, rather than for a particular sound, could be read and understood by all literate people across the entire land, whatever their local spoken dialect happened to be. By standardizing the writing, the first emperor gave to the diverse peoples of his enormous empire a common medium of thought and record and communication, a written unity that would help to hold the vast and varied land together across the ages, long after his own dynasty had crumbled entirely into dust. In a very real and lasting sense, the shared written language that would remain one of the great unifying forces of Chinese civilization across all the centuries owes something to the sweeping decrees of this first ruthless emperor. He standardized a great deal else besides the script. The weights and the measures used throughout the empire in trade and in the collection of taxes were all made uniform, so that a given measure of grain meant precisely the same amount in the Far East as it did in the Far West, a reform of immense practical value to commerce and to administration alike. The many different coinages of the old vanished states were all abolished and replaced by a single imperial currency, round coins of bronze with a square hole punched through the center. And this simple and practical shape would remain the basic pattern of Chinese coins for more than 2,000 years thereafter, jingling in countless purses and passing through countless hands, down through the long centuries. Even the widths of the axles of carts were standardized across the empire, an unglamorous but genuinely useful reform in a land where much of the travel and the hauling of goods followed deep-worn ruts pressed into the earth of the roads, so that a cart built in one province could run smoothly in the ruts of another, and to move his armies and his officials and his messages swiftly across the enormous distances of his territory. The first emperor built a great network of imperial roads radiating outward from his capital, so that the long reach of the central government might extend, at least in principle and intention, into every distant corner of the land. He turned his attention, too, to the troubled northern frontier, where for many centuries the settled farming peoples of China had faced across an uneasy border the horse-riding nomads of the vast northern steppe, mobile and swift and formidable warriors who would sweep down to raid the rich settled lands and then vanish back into the trackless grasslands beyond any hope of pursuit. Various of the old states, back in the days of division, had built long walls of pounded earth along their northern borders in an effort to slow and channel these raiders. The first emperor now ordered these older, scattered walls to be linked together and extended into a single continuous great barrier stretching across the whole northern frontier of his empire. An enormous work of earth and labor meant to mark and to defend the boundary between the ordered agricultural world of China and the open steppe beyond it. This was the distant ancestor of what much later ages would rebuild grandly in stone and brick as the Great Wall. Though we should be clear and honest that the magnificent stone wall that travelers walk upon and photograph today was very largely the work of a far later dynasty, built nearly 2,000 years after the first emperor's own time. What he built was humbler and made mostly of pounded earth, but the great idea was his, the long defensive line drawn deliberately across the north to separate and to protect. And it was built, we must remember, at a truly terrible cost in human toil and suffering, for countless conscripted laborers were driven to work and many to die in its raising, hauling and pounding earth across the cold and windswept hills of the frontier, far from their homes and their families. And here we touch upon the deep shadow that lay across the whole of the first emperor's brilliant and ruthless reign, for the enormous cost of all his grand works fell heavily and relentlessly upon the ordinary people of the empire. To build the roads and the walls and the palaces and the canals, to man the great armies and to garrison the distant frontiers, the state demanded staggering amounts of labor and grain from its population, conscripting men away from their farms and their families for long and often dangerous terms of service, taxing the harvests heavily to feed the soldiers and the laborers and the officials, and enforcing all its harsh demands through the strict and severe laws of the legalist system, under which punishments were cruel and mercy was regarded as a dangerous weakness. For the ordinary farmer, the coming of the great unified empire, for all its impressive standardizations and its grand achievements, meant in practice not peace and ease and prosperity, but heavier burdens, longer and more dangerous conscriptions, and the ever-present fear of falling afoul of the pitiless law. The first emperor's China was mightily ordered and powerful, but it was also hard and heavy and oppressive, pressing down without relief upon the backs of the very people who bore its enormous weight, and the deep resentment that built and simmered beneath its ordered surface would, in time, help to bring the whole grand edifice crashing down. The first emperor's suspicion and his desire for control extended even to the realm of thought and memory itself. Following the counsel of his legalist ministers, who deeply distrusted the scholars that looked back fondly to the ways of the old vanished states, and who used the example of the past to criticize the present order, the emperor is said to have ordered a great burning of books, particularly those texts that praised former times or that belonged to the schools of thought he found dangerous to his rule, sparing only practical works on such useful matters as medicine and agriculture and divination. Tradition also records, in a darker vein, that he had a number of scholars put to death for their opposition to his rule and his policies. We should hold these particular stories with some measure of care, in the honest spirit this history deserves, for the accounts of them come largely from the dynasty that followed and overthrew the Qin, and that dynasty had every reason to blacken and exaggerate the memory of the tyrant it had replaced. And historians continue to debate how much destruction of books and scholars actually took place, and how much was later exaggeration. But whatever the precise truth of the matter, the terrible reputation attached itself firmly to the first emperor and never let go, and later ages remembered him as a ruler who had tried to control not merely the actions and the bodies of his people, but their very thoughts and their memory of the past, a tyrant of the mind as much as of the body. And yet, for all his enormous and unprecedented power, the first emperor could not in the end conquer the one enemy that comes at last for every ruler, however mighty, and for every human being who has ever lived. As the years of his reign passed, he grew increasingly obsessed, even haunted, by the fear of his own death and by a desperate longing for immortality, for some way to escape the common fate of all flesh. He sent great expeditions across the sea in search of legendary islands where, it was whispered, the elixir of eternal life might be found. He gathered around him magicians and alchemists who promised him that they could concoct potions and elixirs that would allow him to live forever and rule his empire without end. And there is a dark and bitter irony hidden in all these frantic efforts, for some of the very substances that his alchemists prepared for him in their search for immortality, potions containing mercury and other slow poisons, may well have damaged his health and hastened the very death he was so desperate to escape. He traveled restlessly about his empire in his final years, inspecting his vast domains and raising great inscribed stones upon sacred mountains to proclaim his achievements to heaven and to posterity. And it was upon one of these very journeys, far from his capital, around the year 210 before the Common Era, that the first emperor at last died, as all men must, his dream of endless life unfulfilled. The strange events that followed his death reveal a great deal about the cold and fragile nature of the state he had built. His death, it is said, was kept a close secret by a small group of powerful officials who were traveling with him, and who greatly feared the chaos and the challenges to their own position that news of the emperor's death might unleash while they were still far from the capital. To conceal the growing smell of the emperor's decaying body, as the great funeral procession made its slow way back home along the imperial roads, they are said to have loaded a cart with rotting fish to travel alongside the emperor's carriage, so that no one would remark upon or identify the true source of the terrible smell. And in the shadows behind the empty throne, these officials schemed and plotted, contriving to set aside the emperor's chosen and capable heir in favor of a younger and weaker son, whom they believed they could dominate and control, and arranging the deaths of the rightful heir and of other potential rivals who stood in their way. When at last the truth of the emperor's death was made known, a weak and pliable young prince sat upon the mighty throne, surrounded and manipulated by scheming ministers, and the great edifice of the Qin Empire, which the first emperor had so confidently meant to endure for 10,000 generations, began almost at once to crack and to tremble. But before we follow that swift and startling collapse, let us pause for a while in the quiet of the night upon one of the most extraordinary things that the first emperor left behind him, a vast monument to his boundless ambition and to his desperate fear of death, a wonder that lay hidden and utterly forgotten beneath the earth for more than 2,000 years before it emerged again into the light of the modern world, in a way that astonished everyone who beheld it. For even long before he became emperor, while he was still only the young king of Qin, this ruler had begun the construction of an enormous tomb for himself near his capital, and into this great tomb he poured, over the decades, the vast resources and the endless conscripted labor of his powerful state. Ancient accounts describe an underground palace of unimaginable wonders beneath a great artificial mound, a whole world in miniature, with the rivers and the seas of his empire recreated in flowing quicksilver, in mercury, and the heavens and their stars represented upon the ceiling above, and the whole guarded, it was said, by ingenious mechanical devices, set to strike down any intruder who dared to violate the emperor's eternal rest. This central tomb chamber has never in modern times been opened, and it remains sealed to this very day beneath its great earthen mound, its secrets still hidden in the darkness, waiting. And yet the fields around that silent mound have given up an astonishment all their own. In the year 1974, some farmers who were digging a well in the dry fields near the great mound struck something strange and hard in the earth. Fragments of fired clay, pieces of what turned out to be figures made of terracotta. When archaeologists came and began, carefully and with mounting wonder, to excavate the site, they slowly uncovered one of the most staggering discoveries in the entire history of archaeology anywhere on Earth. Buried there in great underground pits near the emperor's tomb stood an entire army, thousands upon thousands of life-size soldiers modeled in fired clay, arranged in full battle formation, rank upon silent rank of them, and most astonishing of all, each single figure had been given its own individual face, its own distinct expression and features, its own particular details of armor and dress and hairstyle, as though each had been modeled upon a real and living man. There were foot soldiers and kneeling archers, officers of high rank and humble charioteers, and horses and war chariots, a whole army of clay frozen forever, in the moment before battle, set there in the darkness of the earth, to guard and to serve the first emperor in whatever world lay waiting beyond death. To stand among those thousands of silent clay faces, or even simply to picture them in the quiet of the mind on a night like this, is to feel something of the truly boundless will of the man who commanded their making, and something too of the strangeness and the depth of a belief that saw death not as a final ending but as a continuation, a passage into another existence that would still require an army for its defense and its service. And there is, oddly, a kind of gentleness to be found in walking among those clay faces in the imagination, for each one of those thousands of soldiers was shaped and finished by the hands of a real craftsman, one of the many thousands of ordinary workers who labored upon the emperor's tomb. And though we do not know a single one of their names, their patient work has survived, enduring and quiet, long after the mighty emperor they served has crumbled into dust and shadow. In the individual faces of the terracotta warriors we can see, in a strange and roundabout way, something of the faces of the ordinary people of Qin, the artisans and the laborers whose sweat and skill built the empire and shaped its wonders, and whose descendants would carry the civilization forward through all the ages to come. Long after the dynasty itself had fallen, the first emperor sought immortality through elixirs and through desperate expeditions across the sea, and he never found it, but he achieved in the end a strange and unintended kind of immortality all the same. Not the endless life he craved, but the enduring silence of his buried clay army, which speaks to us still across the vast gulf of the ages. And now the collapse came, and it came with a speed that must have seemed almost unimaginable given the might that had gone before it. The first emperor had held his vast and heavy empire together through fear and force, through the relentless machinery of the legal state, and while his own iron will and formidable capacity had bound it all together, his weak and manipulated successor, a puppet in the hands of scheming ministers, simply could not do the same. The burdens that had been laid upon the common people had grown truly intolerable, the conscriptions seemingly endless, the punishments merciless and without appeal. And according to a famous story that later generations long remembered and retold, it was a small and almost accidental thing that first lit the great fire of rebellion. A group of common conscripts was being marched toward a distant post where they were required to arrive by an appointed day, but heavy rains and flooding along the way delayed them badly, so that it became certain they could not possibly reach their destination on time. Under the harsh and unbending law of the Qin, the penalty for arriving late to such a posting was death. Reasoning grimly that they would be executed whether they rebelled or whether they meekly went on to their punishment, and thus having nothing left in the world to lose. The leaders of this doomed group raised the banner of open revolt, and their desperate, hopeless rising became the spark that set the whole vast empire ablaze. Whether that story is true in every one of its details, historians cannot now say with certainty. But it captured and preserved a deep and important truth about the nature of the Qin state, which is that an empire ruled so harshly, an empire that left its ordinary people no room whatsoever for error and no hope at all of mercy, an empire that made the penalty for a delay caused by mere weather the same as the penalty for open treason, had thereby sown in its very harshness the seeds of its own swift destruction. For once that first desperate rising showed that revolt was possible, rebellions broke out all across the land, as long-suppressed resentments burst suddenly into flame, and as the descendants of the old conquered noble houses of the vanished states saw their long-awaited chance to rise again and to reclaim what had been taken from their families. The weak central government, riven and paralyzed by murderous intrigue within the very palace itself, could not contain or suppress the spreading fire. Within just a very few years of the death of the first emperor, his grand and mighty empire, which he had so confidently declared would last for 10,000 generations, had shattered into warring pieces and fallen entirely apart. The Qin dynasty, which had taken centuries of patient and ruthless effort to build, and which had, for the first time in all of history, united the whole of China under a single rule, endured as an imperial power for only about 15 years. It stands as one of the great and enduring lessons of history, and it was a lesson that the Chinese themselves would draw and ponder again and again across all the centuries that followed, that raw power and harsh law, however brutally effective they may be in the winning of conquests and the building of monuments, cannot by themselves alone hold a great realm together for long, and that a state which rules its people only through fear and never through their willing loyalty and consent will not, in the end, endure. The very legalist engine that had built the first empire with such terrible efficiency had also, through its own pitiless harshness, ensured that the empire would not last. And out of the chaos and the widespread suffering that followed the collapse of the Qin, two great leaders eventually emerged from among the many rebels and warlords to contend with one another for the mastery of a shattered China and their long struggle and its unexpected outcome, and the great and lasting dynasty that arose from it, is the final part of our long night's journey through the first great dynasties of ancient China. One of these two great rivals was a proud and mighty warrior of noble descent, a brilliant and physically powerful general whom history remembers as Shang, a man of tremendous strength and courage and fierce, proud temperament, who for a time seemed all but destined to rule over the whole of China by right of his valor and his victories in battle. The other was a man of far humbler and more obscure origins, a minor local official of common background named Liu Bang, who was neither the greatest of warriors nor in any way noble by his birth, but who possessed instead a shrewd and penetrating judgment of other men, a genuine willingness to listen to good advice even when it contradicted his own first inclinations, and a rare and precious talent for winning, and more importantly, for keeping the deep loyalty of able and talented followers. For several long and bitter years, these two very different men struggled against one another across the war-torn land for control of the fractured empire. And their great rivalry became one of the most famous and most beloved stories in all of Chinese history, retold endlessly in tales and poems and operas for more than 2,000 years afterward. A tale of the proud aristocratic warrior against the shrewd and humble commoner. In the end, against the expectations of very many who watched the struggle unfold, it was the commoner Liu Bang who prevailed over the mighty Shang Yu. For all his tremendous personal prowess in battle, the proud Shang Yu alienated his allies through his arrogance and his cruelty and made bitter enemies where he might have made friends, while the shrewder Liu Bang patiently gathered ever wider support, learned steadily from his own defeats and mistakes, listened to his wise advisors, and slowly, over the years, gained the upper hand in the long contest. The final defeat of Shang Yu and his death left Liu Bang the undisputed master of a reunited China. And around the year 202 before the Common Era, this remarkable man of common birth ascended the imperial throne as emperor, founding a new dynasty that would become one of the greatest, most enduring, and most beloved in all the long history of China. He called his new dynasty the Han, and its founding marks the beginning of what many have regarded as a true golden age. The Han Dynasty would rule, in two long stretches separated by a brief interruption, for some 400 years in all, and it would leave so deep and lasting an impression upon the whole of the civilization that the majority ethnic group of China calls itself, to this very day, more than 2,000 years later, the people of Han. And the written characters of the Chinese language are still called to this day the characters of Han. The dynasty founded by a shrewd commoner out of the smoking ashes of the Qin's swift collapse would give its very name to a people and to a culture across the span of 2 millennia and more. And as this long night draws now toward its gentle close, let us reflect for a quiet moment upon the deep meaning of what happened in that great passage from the harsh and short-lived Qin to the enduring and beloved Han. For it holds within it one of the very deepest patterns in the whole of Chinese history and thought. The Qin had united all of China through legalist harshness, through strict law and overwhelming force, and the deliberate cultivation of fear, and it had fallen with startling swiftness precisely because of that same harshness, collapsing under the weight of the resentment it had bred. The Han, wise enough to learn from that vivid and recent failure, chose a different and more lasting path. They kept, sensibly, much of the practical machinery of central government that the Qin had built, for it had proven its worth, the system of provinces and appointed officials, the standardized writing and the uniform coinage, the unified centralized state itself. But the Han deliberately softened the pitiless harshness of the Qin, tempering the cold and mechanical efficiency of the legalists with the far warmer and more humane teachings of Confucius. With his profound emphasis upon virtue and benevolence, upon ritual and moral example, and upon the reciprocal duties and mutual obligations that bind ruler and subject and parent and child together into a harmonious whole. Over the long course of the Han centuries, the thought of Confucius, which had wandered homeless and largely unheeded through the warring states in the lifetime of the master himself, gradually rose to become the very foundation and the guiding philosophy of the Chinese state and of Chinese education, embraced and honored by the emperors themselves. And the great ideal of the ruler as a moral figure, governing not through naked fear but through virtue and through genuine care for the well-being of his people. An ideal that reached all the way back through the mandate of heaven to the ancient memory of Yu, the great laboring selflessly among the floodwaters, took firm and lasting root in the soil of the civilization. This great union of Qin efficiency with Confucian virtue, of the strong and unified central state, guided and softened by moral principle and by reverence for learning and the past, would become the enduring pattern and the very frame of Chinese imperial government, the shape within which the civilization would live and think and govern itself for the next 2,000 years and more, through the rise and fall of many further dynasties, all of them working out, in their own ways, the lessons first learned in the passage from the Qin to the Han. And so we come, at the very last, to look back gently upon the whole of the long journey we have traveled together through the quiet of this night. We began among the first farmers kneeling in the soft yellow soil beside the great slow rivers, people who left us no words at all, but only their painted pots and their careful graves, and the tender food they placed beside their dead. We passed through the shadowy and half-remembered age of the earliest kings and the uncertain Xia, glimpsed only dimly through the legends and through the platforms and bronzes of Erlito. We entered the world of the Shang with their gleaming bronze vessels and their cracked oracle bones. And we heard across more than 3,000 years the actual living voices of people asking whether the rains would come and whether their children would be safe. We followed the long and thoughtful centuries of the Zhou, who gave to China the profound and enduring idea of the mandate of heaven, the belief that rulers must govern with virtue or forfeit their very right to rule, and who presided, even amid the growing chaos of their own decline, over the greatest flowering of philosophy the civilization would ever know, the age of Confucius and the Taoists and the many other thinkers of the 100 schools. We watched the long, slow unraveling of the Zhou order dissolve into the terrible brilliance of the warring states, and we saw how the cold and disciplined power of Qin at last swallowed all its many rivals and united China for the very first time under a single ruler, the first emperor, who standardized the writing and the coins and the roads, who linked the first great walls across the north, who sought immortality in vain and never found it, and who left behind him an entire silent army of clay soldiers to guard him in the darkness of his tomb, forgotten there for 2,000 years until farmers digging a humble well brought them once more into the light of day. We saw how his mighty empire, so confidently meant to endure for 10,000 generations, fell instead in a mere 15 years, undone, in the end, by its own harshness. And we saw how, out of the ashes of that collapse, a shrewd man of common birth founded the great and enduring Han Dynasty, which wisely softened the hard machinery of the Qin with the gentler wisdom of Confucius, and which gave in the end its very name to a whole people and a whole culture that endures upon the earth to this very day. What remains with us, when we consider the whole of it together in the quiet, is not merely a long list of kings and battles and dates to be remembered, but something far deeper and quieter and more consoling. What remains is the image of a civilization that learned slowly and painfully across these long and eventful centuries how to endure. Dynasties rose and fell again. Empires shattered into pieces and were patiently rebuilt. But beneath all the turning of that great wheel, the deep patterns held fast. The reverence for the family and for the ancestors, the profound belief that rulers owed a real moral duty to their people, the abiding love of learning and of history, the great unifying written script that let people across a vast and varied land share a single common world of thought, and the deep conviction that after every age of disorder a new order would in time arise, that the wheel would turn once more, and that the civilization itself, whatever befell its rulers, would somehow go on and on. The people of these first great dynasties built not only walls and tombs and cities of stone and earth, but ideas and institutions and enduring habits of mind that would carry their civilization forward through thousands of years of change, making it one of the longest continuous human stories upon the whole face of the earth. And there is something deeply consoling in that thought, as the fire burns low now, and the night grows deep and still around us. Every one of the people we have spoken of through this long night is gone now. Every single one of them, the farmers and the kings, the priests who read the oracle bones, and the craftsmen who cast the shining bronze, the wandering philosophers who walked the dusty roads between the warring states in search of a ruler who would only listen, the soldiers who marched to distant frozen frontiers, and the merchants who carried silk along the far roads, the mighty first emperor in his sealed and silent tomb, and the shrewd commoner who founded the Han. Their names, for the most part, are lost to us entirely, their individual joys and their private sorrows long since dissolved into the great and gentle silence of time. And yet they were real, every one of them, as real and as present to themselves as we are to ourselves now. And they woke each morning to the same sun that rises for us. And they worried over their children and hoped for good harvests and feared the floods and the wars, and loved and grieved and labored and dreamed. And then at last they passed on, leaving behind them the great slow river of their civilization to carry their world forward, across all the centuries, to our own quiet night. And when we remember them now, even dimly, even without their names, even as we drift here towards sleep, we do a thing that the ancient Chinese themselves believed to be among the most important and most sacred things a human being could ever do. We honor those who came before us. We hold the past for a little while in gentle trust. We keep, for one more quiet night, the small and steady flame of memory burning in the dark. So let the images settle now, softly, one by one, as you drift down towards sleep, the painted pots resting in the yellow earth beside the great river, the oracle bones cracking gently in the priest's slow fire, the great bronze vessels gleaming in the lamplight of a Shang temple at dusk, the philosophers walking the long dusty roads between the states beneath a wide evening sky, the silent clay army standing in its endless ranks in the darkness beneath the earth, the caravans moving slowly across the western deserts under a sky brimming with stars, the lamps of the great Han capital burning low, one after another, as the vast city settles into sleep. All of it real once, all of it passed now gently into memory, all of it held for this one quiet moment in the stillness of the night. There is nothing more at all that you need to do now. The story is complete, and the fire has burned down softly to its last warm embers, and the long history of the first great dynasties of ancient China rests now in the deep stillness. As you rest, carried gently and without any hurry toward sleep upon the slow, deep river of time. Sleep well, the old world will keep, and it will be here, waiting quietly whenever you should wish to return.